Hi there and welcome.
You're listening to Animals and Us, Voices of a New Paradigm.
My name is Avantika, and I'm a researcher exploring animal consciousness, environmental sustainability, and planetary health. I want to help bring animal perspectives to the table and transform our relationship with the natural world.
And I'm Barbara. I'm an animal communicator and retired veterinarian. My true passion is exploring the hearts and souls of animals and helping people come to a much deeper understanding of who the animals truly are at their core.
This podcast is for anyone who loves animals and nature and has an interest in their own personal and spiritual development. We'll bring you powerful conversations with fascinating people about animal and nature sentience, consciousness, and communication.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey of love, respect, understanding, and care for the fellow beings who share our beautiful Mother Earth with us.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Animals and Us, Voices of a New Paradigm. We have a really special guest with us today, Dr. Marc Bekoff. Marc has won multiple awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, compassionate conservation, and animal protection. He's worked very closely with Dr. Jane Goodall and is the co-chair of the ethics committee of the Jane Goodall Institute. He's written extensively on human-animal interactions and animal protection and believes that the life of every individual matters, not because of what they can do for us, but because they're alive and therefore they have intrinsic value. He's published numerous essays and over 30 books that have been translated into 21 languages.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if you're an animal lover, and if you've ever read articles about animals on the website Psychology Today, there's a pretty good chance you've read some of his work. He's written articles like The Internet of Animals and Earth's Collective Intelligence, The Healing Power of Cows and Other Barnyard Animals, Do Animals Have Spiritual Experiences? Yes, they do. And we're not the only animals who feel grief and spirituality. His work has been featured in Time Magazine, The New York Times, BBC Wildlife, National Geographic, Animal Planet, and he's appeared on CNN, 60 Minutes, 2020, Good Morning America, and the list just goes on and on. Marc, we're so pleased and so grateful to have you here today. When I read some of your work, I just knew that so much of it resonated with me and the kinds of things that Barbara and I love to talk about and that we care about so deeply. And then when we met, I knew we had a lot in common and that it would be so lovely to have you join us on this podcast. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Welcome.
My pleasure. Thank you. This is exciting. I like talking about these sorts of topics other than just science and how humans poorly treat animals.
Yeah, Marc, thank you so much for being here. And thank you from the bottom of my heart, really, for all you've done for the benefit of animals for so many years.
Well,
and I first knew you 50 years ago. I'm dating us. When I was working with coyotes, wolves and coyotes, and you were studying coyotes in the wild. So I knew all about that. And then many years later, I became a dog trainer, and you were studying play behavior in dogs, which was kind of cool. Yeah, and from there, you just moved forward and talked about the emotions of animals, which most people in the scientific world were not even considering. And now I just couldn't believe it that you're actually talking about the spirituality of animals, and that is so cool. So do you want to talk for a minute about this progression and how you got here?
Oh, sure. I don't think it was really a progression, because when I was a kid, my whole background came from minding animals when I was 2 and 3 years old. My folks, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and there was a lot of concrete. There was a couple of trees that all the dogs peed on, and there was nothing much. And I used to talk to all the dogs and the cats and the birds and the ants, and my parents allowed me to do that. And I was always asking them what the animals were thinking and feeling. And I wrote a book that came out in 2002 called Minding Animals. And really the title came from a talk I had with my folks, that I minded them in terms of attributing minds and emotions and, really highly evolved cognitive abilities, and that they were really smart. And I was minding them because I could feel their emotions back then. My mom said I actually said that to her, and she didn't have any concept of how a 3-year-old could come up with that. I'm not quite sure what the words were. Yeah, and I've always kept my, in light of this conversation, I just don't want to deny animals certain, cognitive, emotional, moral capacities. I mean, of course, especially when we have hard data like for animal emotions and cognition. And, I don't know what hard data about animal spirituality and animal communication would look like, but I have enough of my own experiences and stories from people to say that it's surely premature to throw it out, which a lot of people do,
Yeah.
as you well know more than I do. So that was real. So it's always been there as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of, I mean, this is kind of a weird question, but do you have any sense about what the spirituality of animals actually means, what it's like? Do they have spiritual moments like we do? And do you have any sense about that?
No, I really don't. And and sometimes I'm not even sure, at least for myself, how to define what that means.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, I mean, I use words like ephemeral, intangible. Yeah, I mean, and I actually think about that because a lot of the scientific critics would say, well, if you can't define it rigorously and quantify it, it doesn't exist. And I actually think quite the opposite, So I don't know. I mean, I sometimes think about an aesthetic sense of beauty as a intangible, possible spiritual experience. I mean, a lot of wild animals rest 90% of the time. We only see them when they're active because sleeping animals don't make for good documentaries. But they spend a lot of time looking around. So people say, do you think they have an aesthetic sense, a sense of beauty, a sense of belonging? That goes beyond, once again, the tangible in a way, although I guess you could measure it if you wanted to. And my answer is, well, I don't know, but there's no reason to think they don't. Okay. And so I don't know what I mean, when dogs play, I know they're enjoying themselves and having pleasure, but I don't know what each individual's dog or sense of joy might be. But it doesn't mean that I have it and they don't, or vice versa.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And what comes to my mind is my dog, Ari. I have a friend that comes over to watch movies, and he will get by the door and start barking 10 minutes before she arrives.
Mm-hmm.
And Rupert Sheldrake's work about dogs who know their owners are coming home.
Yep.
So don't you think that that's some kind of evidence that there's something beyond the physical that's going on with these animals?
Yeah, I do. I know Rupert, and we've talked about it, and I find his work to be really interesting because back, I think it was in the early 2000s, he submitted a paper where he did all the controls, so it wasn't like a dog. It wasn't like he always drove up his driveway 5 to 6 with his radio on. I mean, there was something beyond that. And he did a study where he had videos on a dog at a home and then a video on their drivers, different number of kilometers away from home. And when you match them, essentially when the person started driving home, the dogs became alert, So 2 people really liked it. 2 people really didn't like it. and the editor of whatever journal it was asked me to be the ref who untied it. So I read it, and I really liked it. And, my response, and I didn't mean it in a demeaning way because Rupert's such an outstanding scientist, otherwise, I just said, look, there's nothing wrong with this paper. It should be accepted. And they did. And then just a year ago, about 3 months ago, just out of the blue, I was talking to somebody and they started giggling and they said, remember that Rupert paper 22 years ago? They said, I was one of the referees who really liked it. So I think they said I suggested you to be the tiebreaker. So what goes around comes around, and nothing with all the internet and all the other stuff is hidden. But I like that example because someone once accused me in writing of saying that animals had ESP, and that's not what I said. It's like our discussion now. Do they have it? I don't know. But I thought his experiments were pretty compelling. And people said, well, how do you think the dog did it? And I said, I don't know. There were more data than it would just be coincidental. I drop a book and my friend in Boulder drops a bottle of pasta sauce. I don't know. But and it is a good example. But I just still think that when you watch animals really carefully, there's more going on that meets your eye or ears or nose. I just really believe that. And until somebody could show me that they don't, and I'm not sure how you would do that, maybe I would be more skeptical, but I don't know if I would be, because science answers a lot of good questions, and it's important, but it may not be able to answer those questions now at this time in history. Yeah.
Yeah, this conversation reminds me a lot of the very first time I think I heard about animal communication and it ever entered my field of awareness. It was a woman it was a radio interview, I think, with a woman who was talking about how she could communicate with elephants. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of anything like that. And I think, first of all, I was like, what did she just say? I was like really just so curious. But really my next thought was, well, how do I know that this isn't possible? Why wouldn't I believe it? And all the possible answers that came up were, had a lot to do with conditioning and just a lack of, ever hearing about something like that before. It's not because I knew for a fact that it's not possible.
Right.
It really made me think, what if this is possible, even if we can't understand how it's happening or why it's happening or the mechanisms. It's pretty incredible if this is possible. And that's really kind of how I got into all of this. And one thing led to another, and I was so fascinated to learn more. And now, after a few years of diving into this, I just think the possibilities are extremely exciting. And like you said, maybe science will be able to explain it, maybe not, but we just don't know. And that's not a good enough reason to reject something, is because we don't know. So, Mark, I think when you and I last spoke, I asked you what your thoughts were on what we're talking about in this podcast a lot and what Barbara and I talk about, which is this ability to communicate with animals. So what are your thoughts on this term, intuitive interspecies communication, and this idea that we can intuitively exchange information two ways with animals?
Yeah, once again, given all the hours I've spent with, a lot of that dogs and dog parks and when I lived at home, but also with other animals, I always feel there's much more going on, I say that meets your eyes or your ears, or your nose, for example. And some the science side of me comes in would be, how could you study it? Could you do it with neuroimaging. So, and because, so many other animals have very different sensory systems than we do in terms of their sensitivity, that they're probably picking up more about me than I'm picking up about them, yeah, and sometimes things happen where I just can't explain they're happening, at sort of really near or at the same time, and so I think something could be going on. But like I said, I have enough stories, and a woman, because I ride my bike a lot, and one of my cycling friends who is, I guess it's funny because I always say she's as grounded could be, but she's an absolute fan of using an animal communicator, who I don't know who they are, to talk about her dog, try to figure out, say why her dog did something, not necessarily bad, but why what might be the explanation for why her dog did something. So it's not like she had to convince me, but she would not, one wouldn't consider her just, Boulder fluffy, because Boulder is known for its fluffiness and its crystals and, all the other paraphernalia. I don't say that demeaningly. I like living here, but we've had talks about it, and she's told me some stories, and they're really compelling. And then there's I can't remember her name now, a very well-known animal communicator. I don't know if she still lives in Boulder. It was in El Dorado Springs, which is just south of Boulder. And I used to talk with her a lot. I've been to her house, with her dogs. And about, it's scary to think 7 or 8 years ago, because it just seems like it was yesterday. I was giving a talk at the Boulder bookstore, and we were shooing people up the steps, so I could talk to the audience. And I was walking up the steps, and she came running, and she said, "Oh, Mark, I didn't realize that was you." And so she said, "I'm sorry I was late. I've been working with or talking to a horse." And so I said, "Wow, that's fascinating," because her work is fascinating. And then she said, "Yeah." And then really without a break, she said, "Yeah, and this horse was born around 200 years ago. And I was talking to a current horse about, I think, something wrong with their neck from an injury." And I mean, on the one hand, if I didn't know her and really respect her work, I would think this woman needs help. Or what have you been drinking or smoking? But the fact is, I mean, she was serious, and that was great. And that, that was just like another example of something that a lot of people I know, a lot of maybe most scientists, but maybe not all, and I'm a scientist, would just toss it and say, "Oh God, that's just ridiculous. Oh, she's just pulling your chain or something." No, well, she wasn't. So having stories like that from her and a woman who I ride my bike with a lot, it's not, it didn't make a change in my mind about animals and spiritual experiences. It just actually reinforced the fact that, hey, if you stay open to it, you might see it. If you close the door to something, you're not going to see it. So that's my attitude right now about a lot of things. And it's very similar to the story of the sort of the evolution of discussions of animal emotions. Back in the 70s and 80s, people would just think you were nuts. Not everyone. And they would say, "Well, no, those animals are just acting as if they're happy or feeling guilt." And I called it the "as if" disclaimer. But when I wrote my first edition of the Emotional Lives of Animals, it was completed in 2006. which would be 18 years ago and published in 2007. And I just published a couple of months ago a revised, updated edition of the Emotional Lives of Animals. And I added 300 or so references. I could have added many more. And the reason I'm telling you that story is, so as more and more data came in, there were fewer and fewer skeptics. And there's very few today, in all honesty. And the few there are, like anything, they're not the silent minority, they're the vocal minority. Will really question you, sometimes aggressively, and I don't respond to that. Sometimes really being obnoxious, I don't respond to that. But I think the number of skeptics among the scientists I know or have read is really declining. And it's because of the science, and it's also because of common sense, and the common sense could be like all mammals have basically the same brains and the same neurotransmitters. So if we have those sorts of experiences, why not other animals? So I haven't changed my mind at all. In fact, I don't know how to say it. And I really think about this. I'm sort of increasingly more prone to say we need to figure out ways to access the intangible spiritual life of non-human animals. And what we learn, it may not be that intangible, but right now it is, because it's kind of hard to directly measure and assign any kind of numbers or empirical support for. And I may be wrong on that, of course, but there's enough stories out there that are compelling.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting time right now, because I think this field of research is emerging. It's going to grow, and I'd love to peek into the future 10, 20, 30 years and just see, what's happening. But Marc, as people, hopefully start to learn about the spiritual lives of animals, or they recognize that animals do have spiritual experiences, do you think that has the ability to change public perceptions and maybe even policies around animal rights and welfare? Do you think that's a possibility? Like, I know that's something we talk a lot about in this podcast is, if we know all these things, or if we're learning these things, what does that mean for the big picture? What does that mean for the future?
Right. Well, I think it does, but like anything else, it'll take a lot of time, and people will remain skeptical until there's more information. I mean, what you just said is exactly what paralleled the growing, or the growing acceptance that animals have, rich and deep emotional lives. Science, common sense, evolutionary biology, sort of, continuity. If we have it, they have it too, or something like that. So I think so. But I think for some people, it'll be a hard sell, just like, just like as we learned more and more about animal emotions, people still, abuse them. The Federal Animal Welfare Act of the United States still says that rats and mice aren't animals. I mean, they inserted something in an early version of it, and in the 2000, I want to say 15, it could be 14, within 10 or so years, when they revised it, they actually added a paragraph, said, we have defined the word animal to exclude laboratory rodents and fishes and birds and insects. Yeah, no. I mean, people don't believe me, but I've written a lot about it, and they really have said that. So if people with, big brains and some degree of intelligence, as scientists, can live with that, it tells me that talking about spiritual lives is going to have a harder time out there. Not impossible, but a harder time. I mean, how can you look at a dog playing and not think they enjoy it? How could you look at, chimpanzees doing something and not convinced that they could feel embarrassed or jealous or guilty or whatever emotion you're studying. But I also think that that possibility of, say, spiritual lives might tap into a different audience that doesn't care about science and everything else. And I haven't done it in a while, but it could be 10 or 12 years ago. I was asked to give some talks in some churches. And I was shocked. I said, sure, I'll do it. And I was told by the people organizing it is that they just wanted people to start thinking about the question you just said, that, what's going on? We know something's going on. And we need, and if you want to study it, you need to think of ways to come up and measure it, if you will. So those invites really got me, I was thrilled about it, because I'm not particularly, I don't practice any religion really. And it had been decades since I'd been in a church, for example, but I really enjoyed it. And the questions that came up were fascinating. So there you go.
Yeah, amazing. Just recently talking about science and acceptance of animals' emotions and spirituality. Recently, I wrote to a scientist who's been researching animals for many, many years, and just wanted her to look at my book. I wrote a book on elephants, and she said, had she endorsed this field, meaning communication with animals, she might be ostracized by the scientific community, since she wasn't able to go there. So, there's so many people that are now opening up to this field, and yet, like you said, the vast majority of people, especially in science and academia, seem to be really removed from it somehow. So we've got a ways to go.
Yeah, no, like Donald Griffin, who's kind of the father of cognitive ethology. So he was a very good friend of mine. And I was at the first, I think it was the Animal Behavior Society. Like, I actually hosted it here in 1976. And I think it was a year after when his book appeared. And there was a little session to talk about it. It was called The Question of Animal Awareness. People thought he was crazy. He happened to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and only the person who discovered, ultrasonic communication, by hanging guitar strings across his room when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. But seriously, and they thought he was, too old. He was older, and he was senile. No, seriously, and so I went through that with him in terms of people just blowing him off as being senile, or, having nothing better to do, which if anybody knew Don, they would know that he didn't have a lot of time to do anything but his work. But yeah, there were people who just said people back then thought the general field of ethology was like stamp collecting. When Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinberg, and Carl von Frisch won the 1973 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, people were aghast. How could three people who just watch animals win the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine? And a review of that event. Yeah, it was in that article where a lot of the critics said, well, they're just stamp collecting. That was the phrase they used. So watching animals had no scientific credibility, which absurd, anyway. Yeah.
So do you think that, I know you've spoken about compassionate conservation. Do you think that recognizing the emotional reality and spiritual reality of animals has some way of contributing to better conservation efforts?
Yeah, I do. And I made a few little notes about that question. I do, just like compassionate conservation, the basic foundation is sentience and emotions, feelings, and that the life of every individual matters. I mean, in a sense, whether they're sentient or not, because they're alive and have an inherent or intrinsic value. So yeah, I think it's just another possible ingredient. I mean, I think it's just related to the question of whether having more and more evidence for, say, non-human spirituality would have an effect on how animals are treated. Are they treated with more respect? Are they, do they become immune from being, tortured? And I think it's the same thing as with asking with spirituality. The more we learn, I think, once again, the more it may be used on the animal's behalf. But things go slowly. And in our book, The Animal's Agenda, Jessica Pierce and I wrote about what's called the knowledge translation gap, which is that specific situation where what we know doesn't translate into how animals are treated. Yeah. And it takes a long time. I mean, the 5 Freedoms for Animals was put forth in 1965, so 60, almost 60 years ago. And while it's pretty lame compared to what we would like today, it was really a very first huge public acceptance that farmed animals, food animals, needed to be treated better. And it was, well, I mean, it was really slow going, and it was really, I like to call it low hanging fruit. Animals, captive food animals should have food and water. They should be given enough space to move around. They should be able to perform species typical behavior patterns. Hello. But seriously, and so and even before 65 years ago, we still, I guess it would be 60 years ago, we still knew that animals had very rich emotional lives. And there probably were people back then talking about animal spirituality, but probably far fewer, historically. I don't know that. You would know that better than me. So, yeah.
Something I've thought about for many years is people love their pets. If you look at the pet industry, it's enormous.
Yes.
What people spend financially and time and resources and energy on their pets. So there's this love of these animals, and that somehow has to translate into a sense that they have an emotional life and a spiritual life, and there's something more to them than just these little furry things running around the house. And I've thought for years, if people really associate with their own personal animals in that way, can't we expand that to all animals, to wild animals, to farm animals? That somehow we need to get through to people that animals all are emotional, conscious beings, not just their beloved dog or cat.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about animals as a gateway. I talk about dogs as a gateway species for, expanding and crossing the empathy gap. And that's exactly why. So I've taken over the last few years, a bunch of years, when we have a discussion, I would say, well, does your dog enjoy playing? Well, what about wolves and related animals? But what about gorillas and chimpanzees and zebras and, other animals? So using the dog as a gateway species, I think is really important because I always say it brings it home, But a lot of people, or a good number, I think things have changed once again for the positive, but a lot of people say, well, dogs are really special. Yeah, they are. So's every animal. But they would say dogs are really special because we made them, we created them, and we have a special obligation to them. And I'm thinking, well, years ago, I remember people coming up to me and saying, oh, if you study dogs, you're not really studying a real animal because they're just artifacts. I mean, things like that have changed radically, but I do. And I know a woman who she's fairly religious, and I think she runs. I want to say she runs an organization or is part of an organization where she is the sort of religion and animals, woman for those interests. And I know they deal with spirituality there. So that always gave me hope, or gives me hope, that more and more people are thinking about these things, and that at some point they will weave into practical, on the ground, um, better animal protection. Yeah. Yeah.
So that leads really well into our next question for you, Mark, which is, I think you've already spoken to this quite a bit, but do you find that science and spirituality can complement each other in understanding animals?
Oh, yeah, I think so very much. I mean, I think you just got to come up with the science that people would say, how do you say this? That people could understand and then apply. So it's pretty easy with emotions, because once again, the obvious examples would be like, you think, do dogs grieve? Do dogs enjoy playing? Because so many, or cats or other companion animals, because people are so familiar with those animals. If somebody really wanted hardcore data, yeah, I think I'm not sure what the data would look like, to be honest with you. But if they're open to the situation, then like I said in the past, I've said, well, yeah, this is similar to the early days of studying animal emotions. People were really dismissive of it; they were critical, but we all, or not a large group, but a group of us stood together and stood strong, saying that there's no way dogs don't have rich emotional lives. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think last time we talked, Mark, you mentioned that it seems like you have this thick exterior where if people say things to you about your work or your perceptions, you don't, you have like a wall there, you don't let it in. So how have your views on animal emotions and spirituality been received by the scientific and
Mm-hmm.
the lay communities, and how have you dealt with that? And do you find that those perceptions are changing?
Yeah. Right. And so the trajectory over the last, I don't know, 40 or 50 years has been a lot of skepticism. I don't want to say wide ranging, but a lot, maybe back then, if you will, the people who were criticizing Don Griffin. But it's narrowed. So, I started also saying, so the real question at hand is not if animals have emotions, it's why have they evolved. So that just gets rid of the discussion on if they have emotions. I mean, to me, it's just dumb to even question that. And the reason I say it is because if you've ever been around a lot of non-human animals, you know that they have emotional lives. They often express in the same way we do, in a giddy way if you're happy, or withdraw, or look like you're moping around, which we might do if we're grieving or sad. So like I said before, I think with the spiritual dimension, it just might be a little harder because it seems softer. That was the word I was thinking of before. Ethology has always been confused, been called a soft science. It's stamp collecting, and so, but that has radically changed. So I think that, once again, applying the fact or the really well-developed idea that animals could have spiritual lives um, could really be better for them.
Don't you think, Mark, when we talk about science, isn't science supposed to be based on curiosity and exploration and openness? And it seems to me like a lot of people have gotten so into the mindset of something that you can't see or feel or prove isn't real without really being open to other possibilities. It seems to me that science has lost something over the years in that process of openness and exploration. Do you think so?
Yeah, no, well, yeah. I mean, I was just telling people that I've been doing all this stuff for a really long time because I'm science should be about being curious, not closing doors. But I think, people are wrong to close the door on the possibility. That's the way I always conclude my talks or discussions about this. Yeah, there's just no great compelling, data that would counter the possibility or the idea that non-humans have spiritual experiences. So if it's something you're interested in, study it. If it's not, bag it, but don't dump it. If you don't like the idea, or if you're threatened that it, or if you're threatened that it's the idea threatens human exceptionalism, because I've had talks about this, about human exceptionalism, where we place ourselves above and apart from other animals. So some people will say, well, it used to be things like emotions, but now we know that would not go. But, well, yeah, something that separates us is that we have spiritual and aesthetic experiences. What do you think? I said, well, I don't know. So I don't think there's any evidence that we should use that in order to put ourselves up on some human-centric, anthropocentric pedestal. I mean, it's absurd, actually. Yeah. It really is. So once again, I think it's a marriage of research, common sense, and a critical mass of people, who are, credible. And, when they tell you a story, they don't have any reason to embellish it, and that's why in this incident, when I was riding my bike back into Boulder, God, it could be 10, 15 years ago, and I saw this magpie funeral. I was with my friend Rod, who doesn't study animal behavior, and I said, I want you to watch this, and then I'm going to write something up and I'll send it over to you, because I wanted to make sure it was correct. I mean, I understand that I could, just unconsciously think I've seen something that I didn't, but I know I didn't, so Rod was great, because I wrote it up and he said, yeah, I saw that too. And then talk about corroborative evidence. Then about 2 weeks after I published, published a little paper on what I saw in the magpies, I got a video from a woman in Canada, clearly different birds, showing me exactly the same thing. So
anecdotal evidence isn't so bad.
Oh, no. I mean, Dale Jameson, the philosopher I've worked with, we still say it sometimes, but the plural of anecdote is data. I mean, if you have 100 stories, which I do for certain things, then no, it's not a rigorous study. But if 95 out of 100 people agree on something, I would give it a lot of attention. So I call anecdote and anthropomorphism the A words. And I think I wrote something and had to dispense with them, and or not worry about the critics. Yeah.
So I'm curious about your relationship with Jane Goodall. Is she open to this animal spirituality, and how did you guys meet after all and end up collaborating?
Well, I believe she is, because she's written about these wonderful waterfall dances that chimpanzees do, and in that description of the waterfall dance, she wonders what they're thinking and feeling. Could it be a spiritual experience? So yeah, no, I think she's open to it, and I don't like speaking for her or anybody, but I think she would agree that it would be really good if someone can study it. But it just came to mind that a couple of months ago, No, it was last year, about a year ago. There was an article on great apes who intentionally spin. They create these altered, and this is published in, I think, the Journal of the Royal Society of London. So I wrote up an article about it for Psych Today, and it was really popular. Basically how these animals were sort of self-inducing, if you will, these altered states of consciousness, and maybe there was a spiritual component to it. Yeah. So yeah, no, I think Jane would be open to it. And I just, I know what it was. I was doing the first edition of my Encyclopedia of Animal Rights and Animal Welfare, and I asked Jane if she would write the foreword for it. That's, yeah. And I hadn't seen her in a while. And so she was visiting Boulder, not on a big trip. She has a lot of friends here, and we did some Roots and Shoots events because that's what I do a lot with her. And that was it. I don't know. She wasn't on email for a really long time. We used to fax or talk on the phone. And she said, I'll be in Boulder. So I said, well, let's get together. And we did at my friend's house. Yeah. And so that was pretty much it. And we did this book called Jane Goodall at 90. It just came out. It's a birthday present to her. If you've seen it or you're going to, I mean, Jane and I share a love for good peaty scotch. And she's got a wicked sense of humor, but I mean, wicked meaning a great sense of humor, but a lot of people don't know that. Yeah. She loves to travel. She's really fun. She's incredibly intelligent and perceptive. And one of the things she's complained about is that people don't appreciate that she has a great sense of humor, which she has.
Avantika and I met in Vancouver for Jane's 90th birthday, and we went to see her, and she talked for 2 hours, and she had a great sense of humor. She just
no. It was it right after her 90th birthday? Because she was in New York on April 3rd. Yeah, that's right. It was. I remember emailing with you, Ivanka. I remember that. Yeah. No, she's great. Her talks are amazing. And we're doing a young kids book now, and we just got a good contract for it. And while we were developing the ideas with a publisher, I would send her emails with the information. And while she was, I don't know, once she was in Tanzania, then the next time she sent an email, love from Chile, and then Argentina, and I don't know where else. And I was exhausted by reading them. But she also, when you work with her, she's incredibly careful. She's very bright. She's incredibly careful. And, when we wrote the 10 Trust, somebody said, well, did you do all the work? And then, she was your co-author and her name is more prominent than yours. I said, no, we worked our butts off on it. I mean, we really did. We worked really hard together on it. And towards the end of it, it was actually right. It was about 6 months before it came out. We were doing some events in the state of Washington. And so we stayed in a house that the people who were hosting us gave us. So we had a week to, give talks, drink scotch, but we really, really worked on the book really hard. So she's a wonderful woman. There's no other, and she didn't tell me to say that.
Yeah, I had the honor of spending a few days with her when she was at the Aspen Institute giving a talk.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a volunteer liaison, and I got to be with Jane. And I was so impressed with that woman. She's up early in the morning working.
Oh, yeah.
She was traveling 300 days a year, and I think she still is. And she was just so incredible. She was just such a inspiration. So I can't even imagine how wonderful that would be to work with her like you do.
Oh, it's really, I mean, it's fun. I mean, it's really fun. And she really, she does the hard work when she's home and traveling and things like that. So, and she's going strong at 90. I mean, she really is. Yeah.
Amazing.
So anyway.
Well, thank you, Mark. This has been incredible.
Oh, this is great. No, you made my day. I had lunch with a friend and he said, "What are you doing later?" I said, I'm not turning on my computer. I'm working on my computer. I'm not looking for any articles on Colorado wolves. I'm doing something on animal spirituality." And he's the kind of guy who would listen to us, but he sort of rolled his eyes. And I said, "I know it's just not something you think about all the time, but I think about it a lot." So
Well,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me. This is wonderful. So
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I'm so glad you're here. And you've said it many times in this conversation that it's okay to say I don't know or we don't know to something. And it's better than rejecting something because of our stubbornness or unwillingness to be open-minded. So thank you for all your hard work. And it gives me inspiration and hope also that, as you mentioned, with the study of animal emotions, that it might take time, but with the small but mighty group of people who believe in something, that over time things can change and our voices can be powerful. So thank you so much for sharing all that. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
no, other than keep an open mind. I think that, maybe new techniques, non-invasive techniques, maybe neuroimaging, I don't know what it would be, will likely open the door to getting more knowledge and asking other questions.
Mhm.
So don't close the door on it. It's just too easy.
Maybe and maybe too early, like we're still
and
exploring.
too early. No, absolutely. But I do think cashing it out in terms of the resistance and then the reduction of resistance to animal sentience and animal emotions is interesting because a lot new ideas often are thrown out, but you need a persistent core group to keep up the efforts. And that's what I've been doing for decades, and other people have too. You just don't give up. When people, it's not like you're stubborn. It's not like I'll show you. It's a fascinating question, from a biological point of view. Why would spirituality evolve? What's it good for? Rather than the question of if it has. You know what I mean? So I always say with emotions, it's not if they've evolved, it's why they've evolved. What are they good for? And how are they used to help adapt an individual to a particular social or other situation? Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that's really interesting. We haven't talked about that before, is not the if or the how, but is the why, and why has that evolved and why is it important? So,
well, the if is a disclaim. The if is just a backdoor out for people. They'll say, "Well, it hasn't evolved. Show us it has," which is hard. But you have these spinning experiments. You have Jane and others, like maybe your own experiences in the spiritual communication realm, and so just you're not accepting it. I was telling somebody about this on another topic a few weeks ago. By accepting it, you're not, by accepting the possibility, you're not saying it's necessarily there, but by denying it, you're basically getting rid of it. So the acceptance of it keeps the door open. The denial closes the door. Let's move on to something else. A lot of the other thing is, I tell people, look in the New York Times, and not only there, the Guardian, a lot of newspapers where a lot of quote hard science results have been retracted because they're not so. And it's not because there's rampant cheating in science. It's not rampant, but there are people who fudge data. So, I said to somebody, the people who were fudging data would have been better off talking about animal spirituality. They would have kept their jobs and they wouldn't have been shamed by their colleagues. But I really mean that, that science is good, but it's not the only show in town. And I've said that for years. And I think that saying science is important is not science worshiping. I've said that before too, but it's accepting the fact that there might be other views of the world, other avenues in to what's happening.
Well, thank you. That's a lot for all of us to think about, keep in mind, and tell our audience, Marc, where they can find you if they're interested in your work.
So my homepage is marcbekoff.com.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, if they just look up Marc Bekoff, Animal Emotion Psychology Today, there's thousands. I mean, I've really written tons, but it's great because the reason I do it is I enjoy writing, but it gets to the unconverted and it gets to a new audience. I mean, it's hard to believe, and it sounds somewhat self-indulgent, but like my my Psychology Today site, Animal Emotions, has more than 10.7 million views.
Wow.
Not 1,000. Seriously. And my editor once wrote to me and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I think I'm just writing about things in which people are interested." So yeah, I mean, that shows there's a lot of interest in this stuff. There really is.
Absolutely. It also speaks to that knowledge translation gap that there is between science and the lay audience.
Precisely. And Paul Ehrlich, who's a very famous population biologist, he wrote The Population Bomb back in 1967 about overpopulation. He always had this I don't want to say requirement, but it might have been that his grad students had to do something practical or use and I've always had that. So whenever I've had a student, even if they were studying something theoretical, I said, you've got to turn this into something that people can use to make the lives of animals, maybe just the animals you're studying, better.
Mm-hmm.
So writing for Psych Today and, for other outlets, it gets to, I always say, Mary and Joe Smith in Kansas, or Mary and Joe Smith in rural Saskatchewan. I don't know where, but it gets to them. And they're the people who you want to get to. They're the people who ultimately might write legislators or a number of them I know have gone to universities and said, "Hey, I've learned that mice and rats have really deep emotional lives. Why are you torturing them?" I mean, seriously, and you just got to get it out there and raise awareness and do something with it. That's why I love Paul Ehrlich's ideas and others where, when people complain, it's like, well, what are you going to do about it? If you're going to complain, people blow off animal emotions or animal spirituality. What are you going to do about it to keep it in the headlights, if you will? Yeah. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
good.
Thank you so much for being here today. And before we wrap up this lovely, fun episode, we want to share a brief blessing for the animals.
We'd like to end this podcast by taking just a moment to be quiet. And we give thanks and blessings to these amazing animals that we share our lives with. They give us so much and ask for so little in return. We hope that you can keep the animals and all living beings in your heart and in your mind as you go about your day. Thank you so much for being here with us today.